you, son. And you know I didn't mean to hurt you. You just can't accept that, because you know me. You've known me for 5 years. Oh, I never would have wanted to hurt Andre.
He walked into the courtroom with slumped shoulders, but his eyes calculated every movement around him. His posture looked fragile, almost broken, yet there was something in the rhythm of his breathing that didn't match the boy who claimed to be devastated. When the judge settled in and the room fell silent, Dylan Schumaker leaned forward, began to shake, and brought his hands to his face. The tears came too quickly, in a loud, forced sobbing, as if he knew every sound would echo through the room. And it did. The public watched uneasily. Some tried to understand whether this was pain or an attempt to shape his own image before everyone present. The problem was that his gestures didn't match the pauses between them. It was as if Dylan studied the crowd's reaction before deciding how hard he should sob. A sideways glance, a calculated pause, a hand pressing against his chest with an almost rehearsed intensity. When he finally looked at the victim's family, he tilted his head, let his voice waver, and asked for forgiveness. He looked fragile, until you looked deeper. His voice broke at the exact rhythm someone in panic would want it to break. The sadness was convincing, but not organic. There was a pattern beneath it, the pattern of someone who believes every tear might change the course of a sentence. The judge noticed. The prosecution noticed. And anyone who knew the case understood that such carefully crafted behavior wasn't a reflection of the crime. It was a continuation of it. And that's exactly where the story goes back in time, to a moment when the tears weren't a tool and the mask didn't yet exist. In 2013, in a small community in western New York, Dylan was just a 16-year-old trying to fit into a world that always felt bigger than him. There was no history of violence. No signs he could become the center of a case that would mark the region for years. His girlfriend, Ashley, worked at a local restaurant and with few options, asked him to watch her 2 young children during her night shifts. The deal was simple, a few hours, meals ready in the fridge, and the expectation that a responsible enough teenager would be there when needed. But responsibility is not an automatic trait. Sometimes it's a difficult construction for someone trapped between impulsivity and the need to prove something they can't define. On that particular night, the youngest child, a 23-month-old boy, was restless. He cried non-stop, as children his age do. He cried from exhaustion, hunger, frustration, maybe nothing in particular. And Dylan, alone, inexperienced, and already irritated by his own limits, reacted in the worst way possible. Authorities reconstructed that night with uncomfortable precision. The boy cried. Dylan tried to calm him, but his patience dissolved quickly. He later admitted he had hit the toddler. Said he lost control. Said things got out of hand. That he let himself be carried away by a toxic mix of irritation and emotional inability. The breaking point came when he put a pillow over the child's face to muffle the crying, and hit him again. There was no stated intention to take a life, but intention doesn't always determine the outcome when such a small body is placed before violence. When paramedics arrived, they found Dylan in shock, repeating that it had all been an accident. That the boy had fallen. But the injuries told another story, one far harsher and impossible to reconcile with his improvised version. Doctors and investigators quickly spotted inconsistencies, and Dylan's narrative began collapsing before he even realized it. The following hours unfolded like a film the protagonist himself couldn't keep up with. Questions, contradictions, pressure from adults who left no room for invention. Eventually, he admitted what he had done. He was taken into custody, awaiting trial. The community reacted with shock. The newspapers reported the tragedy. And the victim's family sank into grief so deep it seemed impossible to measure. In that context, the trial became an emotional stage. The prosecution presented facts. The defense tried to soften public perception, arguing he was an inexperienced boy, with no record, no preparation. And Dylan leaned on the only strategy he believed could save him, emotion. It was on sentencing day that everything exploded. The tears, the sobbing, the trembling hands. It all looked like the perfect portrait of youthful remorse. Until the judge brought up the content of a recorded phone call Dylan made in jail days before the hearing. A single sentence dismantled the entire performance. He had told his mother that all he needed to do was cry in front of the jury to earn sympathy. And that cold, calculated comment echoed through the courtroom.
That on July 23, 2013, in a phone call to your mother from the holding center, you stated, and I got a quote from the court reporter, "I am a 16-year-old blonde Probably all I have to do is cry in front of the jury, and they're going to feel sorry for me." End quote.
The playback shattered the facade he had built in front of everyone. The fragile figure sobbing there wasn't the expression of remorse. It was the expression of a plan. The judge looked at him with steady resolve. Explained that no words spoken that day were enough to escape the reality of the facts. And then announced the sentence: 25 years to life. The room went rigid, silent, as if everyone absorbed the weight of that decision at the same time. The performance had ended, and the final act allowed no room for interpretation. Even after the judge read the sentence, it felt like the case still wasn't over. The community left the courtroom with different expressions, some relieved, others disturbed, others simply exhausted. But there was an unease in the air, something hovering between justice and doubt. A teenager sentenced to decades in prison for a devastating act. And still, in some circles, the question lingered: what exactly had those tears represented? Remorse or calculation? Sincerity or self-preservation? The answer seemed clear to those who heard the recording, but not everyone wanted to see it the same way. In the months that followed, the story echoed throughout the region. It became impossible to discuss crimes involving minors without Dylan's name surfacing. Parents mentioned it in school meetings. Teachers debated among themselves the limits of emotional maturity. The news outlets kept replaying the scene from the hearing, emphasizing the tension between youth and responsibility. The line between punishment and rehabilitation became a constant topic. And meanwhile, Dylan remained in prison, far from the spotlight but not forgotten. The defense, however, wasn't willing to accept the outcome as final. Over time, it built arguments, gathered documents, reviewed case law, and consulted specialists who believed that a 16-year-old sees the world differently, reacts to impulses differently, and under pressure, can cross lines he doesn't fully understand. Not to justify the crime, that was impossible, but to question whether the sentence reflected his age or only the tragic result. 3 years later, a new development brought Dylan's name back into public debate. An appellate court reviewed the conviction and decided to reduce the sentence to 18 years to life. It wasn't an acquittal, and it wasn't forgiveness, it was a reassessment. The judges considered factors such as his young age, psychological records, and lack of prior offenses. The decision had an immediate impact, especially among those who had followed the original trial. For the victim's family, the revision felt like a reopened wound. It was impossible for them to accept the idea of a reduction, because nothing in the world could reduce the emptiness left by a life cut so brutally short. For others, though, the reconsideration seemed consistent with a justice philosophy that takes into account the incomplete development of teenagers. A society often reveals itself in how it handles its hardest cases, and this was one of them. The streets, online forums, and local radio shows became platforms for intense opinions. Many remembered the phone recording and argued that it showed the truest picture of Dylan's mind, someone willing to manipulate. Others countered that teenagers can react with bravado, arrogance, or attempts to downplay situations when talking to family, especially under extreme stress. The truth lived in layers, some harsh, some uncomfortable, all difficult to interpret with absolute certainty. As the debate grew, a rarely discussed question surfaced: what led to that moment of eruption on that specific night? Investigators and psychologists suggested there wasn't a single trigger, but a silent mix of inexperience, impulsivity, and emotional incapacity. Still, none of those elements could explain, or justify, the final outcome. And it was exactly that complexity that made the case so unsettling. What was being judged wasn't just a crime, but the empty space between intention and consequence. The case gained national attention when investigative programs revisited the trial's trajectory, highlighting the contrast between his behavior in court and the phone recording. The pairing of those two images, the boy crying in front of the victim's family and the same boy, days earlier, saying he just needed to cry to gain sympathy, looked almost like a cinematic portrayal of human duality. The question forming in viewers' minds wasn't only whether Dylan deserved punishment, but what this episode revealed about the emotional and moral fragilities of a society that constantly navigates the blurry lines between guilt and remorse. Even so, no matter how far the analyses went, one point remained unchanged: nothing could restore the life lost that night. And that was the emotional anchor of the entire story. Behind the trial, the appeal, and the legal debates, there was a 23-month-old boy who couldn't defend himself, couldn't ask for help, and couldn't tell his own version. All that remained were adult voices trying to reconstruct what happened, trying to understand it, trying to make sense of what has no sense at all. When the court announced the revised sentence, the overall feeling was different from the one during the first hearing. There wasn't the same anticipation, nor the same shock. It felt more like the closing of a wound that never fully heals but slowly stops bleeding. Justice, imperfect as always, did what it could within the limits it knew. And the case, even after all those years, continued to echo as an uncomfortable reminder that human decisions are never simple.